Hello everybody, welcome back to Comedian MTG. This week we're covering Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers, and we're covering their place in cEDH. We're gonna go on Scryfall here, all the spoilers that have been revealed so far according to Scryfall. We're gonna take it from the most early spoiled and then go up to the most recent. And we're gonna talk about those spoilers and whether they can see cEDH play, where I expect them to see play, things like that, our great first impressions. So first off, we have Kaido Shizuki. I think this card is actually pretty interesting. It's hard for a Planeswalker to see play in cEDH. The fact that it makes a body on the minus is really cool. At the beginning of your end step, if it came in this turn, so the first turn you play it, it actually flickers itself out. There's some cute stuff you can definitely do with Animatu in this card. The fact that it has a draw card that can kind of be unconditional for 3 mana. So if you're playing a deck that's already attacking a lot, so something like a Tymna-based deck, a Yuriko type deck, the +1 then just becomes draw card. That's pretty strong for 3 mana to be able to just immediately replace itself the turn it comes down, protect itself during the first turn, and then, you know, next turn you can continue upticking it and draw more cards off of it. You can make unblockable ninjas, stuff like that. So the card definitely has some ability to see play. The fact that the minus ability actually feeds into the plus ability is kind of cute. I can definitely see it being in like a Tymna style deck, anything with Yuriko. I know for a while, like way back in the Flash meta and from the Lab Maniacs, was playing like sort of like a mid-range Planeswalker Tymna Crom deck, and I definitely think like if you're looking into that style where you're like really trying to grind a lot of values with your mid-range threats, I think this card could, because of how cheap it is, end up being something like that. So we're gonna move on. We have a new cycle of legendary dragons. They all have when they die abilities. This one's kind of interesting because it creates 3 treasure tokens when it dies. Now there are, I'm not saying in the command zone per se, but I know for a fact there are going to be loops, because when things die, they make mana, tends to be an ability that ends up doing some pretty nutty stuff. So I could definitely see like a deck coming about that somehow abused this creating 3 mana when it dies thing. I'm not sure what that deck would be, but it's kind of interesting to think about and just kind of throw out the idea that like maybe there's something more to that card. The new Hidetsugu is kind of lame. It's definitely like an interesting card for casual, but it's you flip over the top card and it deals damage to people, nothing too crazy. The neon arts are super cool in this set. I'm very excited for the artwork. This is very much my style. I love like over the top neon colors, stuff like that. If you haven't seen these basics, these are the basics in this set, and they're stunning, like absolutely fantastic. My favorite is this island here, but this swamp is also like gorgeous. And I know this isn't the show about the art on these cards, but I had to talk about it. All right, then we have Satoru Umazawa. Now, I had a live brew with Hire from Playing with Power on this very channel, so you can go check out that video if you want to find out more about how we would build this deck. But basically it ends up being blue-black sneak attack with consultation lines as backup, which, you know, can only be so bad. It's not my personal cup of tea because of the way you have to build the deck with, you need evasive threats, but you also need to have high power threats like Jin-Gataxias and stuff like that. And when you have so many contradicting things, it doesn't leave a lot of room for like responsible amount of removal and like proactivity. So I'm not a huge fan of it, but I can easily see this deck seeing play at a table. I can definitely see it a lot more interesting for definitely other people who are more into this style of deck. But all of that being said, it is definitely a deck you should expect to see in cEDH pods moving forward. I definitely think it's a real deck, and you know, it's a blue-black consult deck with another completely different avenue of attack and being able to play all your interaction. No real downside to the command zone. It's just a little bit on the slower side, more of a mid-range type blue-black deck. We're powering past some stuff. Tamio is pretty cool, but not really cEDH playable. Thousand Face Shadow, on the other hand, this is like a card perfectly designed to make Yuriko better. I don't think Yuriko is like a tier 1 deck, but I like if they keep printing more and more good ninjas, there's a certain point where it's gonna like just get there on the fact that the deck has just become so efficient. So this one's really cool because it's a 1/1 flyer, so it's already a great evasive threat for a deck like Yuriko. And then if you pay the ninjutsu costs, you also get to make a token that's attacking. Pretty cool. Now it's pretty interesting because it enters the battlefield. I don't know, because you have to declare ninjutsu on an unblocked target. So I guess they don't get a chance to block again because the blocker step has already been declared. If anyone knows the ruling on that, I'd love to hear about that in the comments below, because that's kind of interesting that it automatically makes a copy of another creature coming in, and it makes it unblockable if I'm reading this correctly. So that's kind of huge, because if you have something that has like a really powerful, like when this deals combat damage trigger, that's kind of this card is a way to ensure that that happens. Obviously, this is like a snap include in Edric, it's a snap include in Yuriko, and I think there are definitely going to be a decent amount of decks that play this card. I think it's really cool. It's a really unique design. I love a lot about this card. It's very, very cool. Moving on. Just double checking I'm not missing any cool stuff here. Now, these are more of the Dragon Cycle that I mentioned. Nothing crazy from these two. Obviously, they have like powerful effects, but I don't see them seeing a lot of play. Some new shrine stuff. The Wandering Emperor, it's canonically, it's the Wanderer. It's got some niche implications. The fact that so it's a flash planeswalker, and the turn it comes in, you can activate the abilities at instant speed, and it's only for that turn. It's cute. You can make bodies at a pretty efficient rate. It's a removal spell technically, but all of that being said, it's 4 mana for a pretty medium effect, and like, yes, the flash part definitely mitigates some of the downsides to planeswalkers, the fact that it can flash in and then be used as a removal spell in response to something. It's just, it does not feel strong enough. A new Tezzeret's pretty cool. First activated ability of an artifact you activate each turn costs 2 less to activate. So if you have an artifact creature in the command zone, the one that's coming to my head is obviously Cody, but that's not one that you ever want to play this card in. But if for some reason you're playing like an artifact creature commander that's ability is like a big part of the deck, and especially it's because it says each turn, not each of your turns. So like if it has an ability that you can activate over and over again, I don't know off the top of my head if something like that exists right now. Actually, let's go check. Let's use the power of Scryfall here to see if this is a commander that exists instead of talking in hypotheticals.
Okay, so we're talking about artifact, creature. It is a commander, and it has blue in it.
Okay, so we got Brea. That's kind of cute. That's it. Okay. So Brea, it works with Brea. You could use Brea for free once a turn. That's kind of cute. Yeah, it's a medium value. So if a card like that was ever printed, Tezzeret would be kind of cool in that style of deck. The art, by the way, it's absolutely awesome on these ones, especially this one over here. Big fan. But it's worth noting that like if that effect ever were to come out, that's a pretty cool way to abuse that effect. Apart from that, the abilities aren't that great. +1 is draw 2 and then discard 2 unless you discard an artifact. Pretty medium. And then can turn artifacts into 4/4s. It's overall, it's probably not going to see play unless they print a commander that ability becomes very relevant. We got a new Jin-Gitaxias, which is good for decks like Hire's mid-power Kinnan list. We have, any Reanimator style decks probably going to use this. It's a pretty unique card. Whenever you cast an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell, you can copy it, and you can choose new targets for the copy. It's pretty cool. And whenever your opponent casts one of those, gets countered, so that's pretty cool. It's a very powerful stacks effect if it hits the battlefield. I was talking with Hire about this card, and my biggest complaint about it is the fact that it doesn't progress you towards winning the game. Like, for example, something like Vilis Razaketh or the old Jin-Gitaxias. But if you are playing a deck where you are trying to just dump big fatties that accrue you a lot of value, and you have like a continual way to do that with your game plan, this is definitely a really strong stacks effect. Like if your deck wants a Void Winnower, or which is also, in my opinion, a criminally underplayed card, but if your deck wants a Void Winnower, it probably wants this new Jin-Gitaxias as well. It's a really cool card, a really interesting design. It's definitely good if you have a way to cheat big creatures onto the battlefield. So especially like Kinnan decks, this seems pretty strong. Hey, we have Silver Fur Master. Now this is an interesting one because it makes your ninjutsu abilities cost 1 less. You can ninjutsu for blue and black, and it gives your ninjas and rogues +1/+1. So it's already kind of cool because rogues tend to be the other subtype that have really high evasive abilities. So for a deck like Yuriko, this is really just like a solid anthem. I don't know if those decks really need an anthem effect. It might help with like certain creatures being able to get in during combat. The ninjutsu ability costing less, I don't think is going to be that relevant, but all of these things are good to know. And Silver Fur Master also tends to work with Satoru Umazawa because Satoru gives your other things ninjutsu 4. So it's kind of cool that Silver Fur Master can come in, draw you a card with Satoru's ability because it allows you to look at the top 3 and take a card, and makes your ability to cheat in creatures creatures cost 3 instead of 4 mana. So it's a cool synergy and works really well in that deck specifically. So it's definitely, once again, getting some new interesting ninja stuff here, making Yuriko even stronger. You keep getting like more and more pieces to make that deck actually really good. So this is the biggest card so far, a Seiju Who Endures. Now this card is kind of insane. It's a legendary land, adds green mana, doesn't come in tapped, doesn't hurt you. Just basically a non-basic forest, and it has channel, so you can discard it for 1 and a green, destroys an artifact or enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. They get to look for a basic, put it in the battlefield tapped. Oh, battlefield, not tapped. And it costs 1 less for each legendary creature you control. So, because this is commander, this often costs 1 mana, so a single green, to discard this card from your hand, destroy an artifact, enchantment, or a non-basic land. This is an uncounterable rule of law removal piece for ad nauseam decks, for other combo decks that do not want to run in to a rule of law. This is an uncounterable Nature's Claim effect. Yes, it gives them a basic tapped. Yes, people have been skimping on basics lately and often not playing them in general, which is kind of crazy. Now, to be fair, rule of law decks tend to be lower color decks, like 2 or 3 color decks, a lot of the time. So that being said, they tend to be decks that play basic more, but this card is kind of free in up to like 3 color decks. Then in decks like, I've heard this is talked about in Najeela, which I think it actually would be a really solid include in there, because instead of putting it in a land slot, you put it in a spell slot, and then sometimes it's a land that fixes your mana, and then other times it is just an uncounterable Nature's Claim effect and or a wasteland effect. And yes, sometimes they get a basic, but the upside on this card is kind of insane. Like, this is a very, very pushed effect. I think this card is wild. I think this card is going to blow out so many people. I think people are going to lose to this card after playing really, really tight. I think you're going to, be in a position where you like accrue getting your opponents out of removal. You have protected win. You're going to go for that win, and you're just going to lose to Boseiju because you can't counter it. And people don't play Stifle effects, probably for good reason. We've seen so far, I think this is the best card of this cycle, but I'll point out the other ones as we go along. The reality chip's pretty interesting. People are talking about it as like a mono blue Elsha. It's just so much worse than Elsha in a lot of ways, and I don't really get the appeal of playing this card. Yes, you can play lands off the top, but you don't get to break timing restrictions like Elsha does. You lose your access to white and red. Elsha is already not like a tier 1 deck as it is, and I don't know why you would really want to play a worse version that also like needs creatures on the battlefields and stuff like that. Now you can cast creature spells. That's kind of cool. So like creatures aren't going to ruin it. You can play the lands off the top. It's definitely different than Elsha in a few ways. It can be creature heavy, but it's also mono blue. So how creature heavy do you want mono blue to be in the first place? I don't know. It's interesting to have like a future sight in the command zone, but there are enough downsides to it that I don't really see it making too big of a splash. It's definitely something interesting, and I can see wanting to play it just to test it out, because as I mentioned, the fact that it's not limiting you to creatures and it allows you to at least play lands is kind of cute. There's a lot of setup with this card, like a lot of setup with this card, and I don't know if that's really what you want to be doing. Enthusiastic Mechanist, I could easily see this seeing play in a deck like Joyra. Making your artifacts cost less is usually how that deck pops off, and if Elsha didn't care more about creatures, this would be a card that would be played in that deck too. Have an interesting version in the enchantment version. They have things cost less. At some point, there's going to be an enchantress deck in cEDH. It's not here yet. For some reason, we haven't cracked that little one, but it'll come around at some point. So this one, it's an Elvish Visionary in white. Whenever it enters the battlefield, it draws cards, Spirited Companion. It's not great, but there's a world where I can see it seeing play somewhere, because the fact that getting a body and cantripping in certain archetypes in certain decks, especially if there's an enchantress deck, right? Like imagine you have a couple enchantress effects out, you play this card, it cantrips itself and it gives those cast triggers. I can definitely see this card at some point seeing play. I think it will be slept on, and I think at some point people will see this card, whether it's in 60 card, whether it's in cEDH, this will see play at some point. Now, here we have a creature that is currently being brewed in the Comedian MTG Discord at the current moment, Tamishi, Reality Architect. Now it says whenever one or more non-creature permanents are returned to your hand, draw a card. This ability triggers only once per turn. And it's a 2/3 for 2 and a blue. And you can do X in white to return a land you control to its owner's hand. Return target artifact or enchantment card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. Now, it's an interesting card. The reason it is being talked about is because, and first of all, it has a blue-white color identity because it's blue in the casting cost and a white activated ability. But specifically, the bottom part allows you to return a land you control to its owner's hand at being Mystic Sanctuary. And if you have Mystic Sanctuary able to be bounced back to your hand every turn, and you can use that as your land drop, you're able to use effect like a Time Warp or Temporal Manipulation, an extra turn effect. You can play an extra turn, play a Mystic Sanctuary, put it back on top of your library, activate Tamishi, putting Mystic Sanctuary back into your hand so that next turn you can play it and repeat that loop. So it's an infinite turn combo in blue-white. It's pretty interesting. There's also a lot of cute stuff that you can do with this commander, things like bringing back your Mystic Remora every turn just for the cost of 2 mana and bouncing a land. I think you have to find a way for this to be good while also recognizing the fact that you need to like add extra land drops, so I think that's definitely gonna be a constraint of this deck, getting to enough lands and islands for Mystic Sanctuary loops to happen in the first place. But it's a really cool card. I think it could definitely be a deck. I know that there are definitely a lot of restrictions on this card that make it worse, which is pretty unfortunate. Like the fact that its draw ability is restricted to once per turn, and the fact that your return a land for an artifact or enchantment ability is also restricted to sorcery speed. I just wish this card wasn't restricted as much as it is, because it's kind of unfortunate, because it's a really, really cool design that they really just kept adding little things to make it just like a little bit worse. And I'm aware there's probably ways to make it very broken at certain, aspects of it, but I don't know, I definitely feel like they could have pushed this card a little more without it being absolutely insane. Mirror Box is pretty cool because this is a better, cheaper mirror gallery, and there are just really cool things you can do with it. It's also like Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. It's cool to be able to break that rule a little bit, making multiple copies of legendary creatures. Now, what exactly you can do with that, I don't know if there's a cEDH implication here, but I think it's definitely worth at least talking about. It's a cool card, and the fact that it's way more efficiently costed nowadays than that effect has ever been is pretty cool. However, when you can have it in the command zone with Sakashima, it's hard to imagine that there's really going to be a use for this card outside of a deck that would already have Sakashima in it. So it's just cool to look at, and it's a unique effect, so it's worth mentioning. Sokuzen Crucible of Defiance, however, is super cool. It's once again the land cycle we talked about earlier. You can discard it for 3 and a red, create 2 1/1 colorless spirit tokens. They have haste until the end of turn, and it costs 1 less for each legendary creature you control. This is kind of just a free include for Winota. I feel like we've been getting a lot of like free includes in the land department in that deck. This one's pretty unique. It's just with Winota out, this costs 3. And once again, 3, something that's uncounterable, gets around tax effects, gets around rule of law effects, and creates 2 hasty threats. You can also do this at your end step, so you can, like, if you pass with some mana up, maybe you're holding up like an Aven Mind Sensor or something like that, and then you want to be like, okay, I'm gonna use this channel ability at the end step. There's also a lot of legendary creatures in Winota, so the odds of this costing less than 4 by at least a good amount are actually pretty decent. So Sokuzen Crucible of Defiance is like pretty sweet in Winota. Once again, getting around rule of law effects, it's huge. Getting around timing, there's a lot of good stuff, and the fact that it's basically free is kind of insane. So big ups for Sokuzen. Big fan of this card. Oh, I gotta get that art. That's hot. That's hot. So we have a new version of a Goblin Welder effect. It's a pretty fair version, costs 3, returns a thing with X being less than the one that you sacrificed. So it's pretty bad, but I could easily see there being a world where this card technically sees play. I don't think it will. It's a little overcosted, but it's worth noting that there is another Goblin Welder effect that exists. So March of Otherworldly Light is an interesting card. I am lower on it than a lot of people I know. The fact that people can be comparing it to Prismatic Ending, Prismatic Ending's pretty unplayable in cEDH, or if it is, it's really only like playable in very, very specific spaces. This one is an instant, but the fact that you have to either pay a lot of mana into this to hit the target you want to hit, or the fact that you have to remove multiple cards from your hand to cast this for free is a lot. And also, you can't actually cast it for actual free because you have to at least pay 1 mana into it. The people have been comparing this to Solitude, and I don't think that's really a comparable card whatsoever, because the fact that you have to pay at least 1 white into this, the fact that you have to pitch either multiple cards from your hand or pay a kind of silly amount of mana into this card makes me pretty low on it. I just know people were excited about it. I don't understand the excitement, and I would be very surprised if this actually sees play for any amount of time. I think people might try it at first, but I do not think it's a good card. Now, Joyful Procession, on the other hand, is the same cycle as the one we just talked about, except for I think it's a little better. So you can exile the top X cards of your library until the end of turn. You can play up to 2 of those cards. Now, the restriction of being only able to play up to 2 of them is definitely a decent downside. I'm not gonna lie about that. But the fact that it's an instant, so you can do this at end step, tap out a good amount of mana into it so that you untap and have a bunch of cards in exile to be able to play, only once again limited to 2 of them. The fact that you can, use other red cards to be like, okay, this, say you have an Abrade in hand and you're like, I don't need an Abrade right now. What I need is my combo piece and I need to win this next turn. You're like, okay, I'm going to exile that. Now I have 2 more cards to look at to hopefully be able to find my combo piece. It's pretty interesting in that specific light. I think like it has to be a low color red deck that wants to play this card, especially because you want to be a deck that needs this draw in a very specific way. I could see this seeing play in a deck like Prosper. Makes sense. Exile stuff is just kind of played in that deck in general. But this card's pretty interesting. Don't know if it's actually gonna see play. I definitely think especially like mono red decks, I think it is much more likely to see play, and I think it would be a really big tempo advantage to be able to even cast this for a single red, exile 2 red cards. Now you're looking at 4 cards and you can play 2 of those your next turn. That seems pretty decent to me. So I think it's definitely worth looking at. Once again, it has to be lower color red decks that really need that card draw. Interesting that we have a green ninjutsu card here in our Kappa Tech Wrecker. Ninjutsu's comes in with a death touch counter. If it deals combat damage to a player, you can remove the death touch counter and exile an artifact or enchantment that player controls. Once again, I think the first green ninjutsu card is kind of cool. It's a unique effect for sure. I don't know how much we want like a one-time removal for exiling artifacts and enchantments. Exiling is pretty cool. That's pretty strong, but at the same time, how many green decks really are playing into the ninjutsu play style? I think that's definitely something to think about when you're looking at this card. So it's a unique card. I don't know that it's going to actually see much play. Moonsnare prototype is interesting because it's kind of like a Springleaf Drum. You tap an untapped artifact or creature and you can add a colorless mana and it costs a blue. So it's much worse than a Springleaf Drum in the fact that it is harder to cast, but I can definitely see it in Rograk style decks. I might play this in Temur Polykraken because Springleaf Drum's obviously really good with Rograk and really good with Thrasios, seeing as they're so easy to cast. It's definitely worse than a Springleaf Drum 95% of the time, and then occasionally it's gonna be a 5 mana uncounterable tuck non-land permanent, which definitely could be worse in the late game. So the fact that the front half has utility and the back half is actually not that bad, despite being very expensive for that effect. However, uncounterable removal for a non-land permanent as a secondary effect for a card that's already got some decent implication is definitely something to look at. Like, I think it definitely could be a lot worse, and I think that if you're playing a deck that already kind of likes Springleaf Drum type effects, I can definitely see this in a deck like Urza. Anything with Rograk I think definitely plays this. A lot of Thrasios decks I like Springleaf Drum in. So if you're in that general vein of brewing where you're talking about those type of effects, I think this card is actually pretty decent. It's weird for a common to be kind of that weird playable sort of draft chaffy effect, but it does enough where it's actually pretty okay. Tatsunari Toad Rider is pretty interesting because it's if you get infinite enchantment casts, it can drain the whole table. I don't know how you get infinite enchantment casts in a Sultai deck, but if someone is able to figure that out, that's pretty cool. And this art is freaking awesome. So Twin Shot Sniper is interesting to look at because it is, like, it's not a good card, but the channel is for 1 in a red. You can discard it and it does 2 damage to any target. So that's an uncounterable 2 damage. Now Sudden Shock already exists as a card, but I'm wondering if the fact that, one, it's a goblin, it's an artifact, so it's like way more tutorable in low color decks, like mono red decks with things like Goblin Matron and Imperial Recruiter. So it's kind of interesting. There's a world where this could be considered in Winota if 2 damage is really relevant in the current meta. So say they print a Grafdigger's Cage on a 2-drop, then maybe being able to Imperial Recruiter and grab this uncounterable 2 damage could see play somewhere. There are other effects that might want that as well. So I guess if you're in a deck that wants 2 damage to be a relevant factor in the deck, then this card is actually kind of cool because it's a weird, like, kind of bad draft uncommon, but it's an uncounterable shock, and that's something worth at least like noting. It's a weird card, definitely a weird card. Lion Sash we're talking about is a 1/1 for 2 artifact creature equipment cat, and you're like, how is it an equipment and a creature? Because it has the reconfigure ability. Basically, these cards with the reconfigure are creatures until you equip them to something, then they become equipments. When they are equipped, they are no longer creatures. It's kind of like a weird bestow, but backwards. It's a unique ability, and it, like, so you can exile a card from a graveyard, and if it's a permanent, you put a 1/1 counter on Lion Sash. So you either have a 1/1 counter on Lion Sash, which will make it bigger, or you can have a 1/1 counter on the creature that it's equipping, because the creature gets 1/1 for each 1/1 counter on it. So you can equip this to a creature, and then say you exile a permanent, you are now giving that creature +1/+1, etc. for every time it grows. We are looking at this in the Winota server because it's basically the white scavenging ooze. I don't love it. Sometimes you play effects you don't love because the effect is good enough. I mean, we're still playing cards like Cavalry Pegasus, which are cute and which definitely do work in games, but this creature is far more able to interfere with what our opponents are doing than something like a Cavalry Pegasus, which is just there to generate Winota triggers. Now, unless you're pumping a lot of white mana into this, it is easy to block and easy to get rid of. You don't really care about the reconfigure ability. There are certain Winota variants that care about the fact that it's an artifact creature. I care more about that in a negative space where it makes my opponent's docksides bigger. The biggest problem I see with it is that white mana is already a very high premium in Winota. Holding that up all the time is not something we have the luxury of doing very often. I think it's a good effect. I just worry that the practical play patterns don't actually lead to it being good in the deck, which is unfortunate because it seems like something we want. Now, if that ability was colorless, this would be a much different conversation, but because it's a white activated ability, I think it's definitely something worth noting for this card. Banishing Slash is kind of cute. It's super flexible, which is why I want to talk about it, because it destroys an enchantment, artifact, or tapped creature for 2 mana, and it also has the ability to give you a body if you have an enchantment and an artifact. I don't think you should rely on the fact that you have an enchantment and an artifact to evaluate this card, but the flexibility on that first part is definitely worth talking about. I'm not sure if it's good. I could see this seeing play. Now, the fact that it's a sorcery is definitely tough. This is the biggest downside of this card by far. Once again, the flexibility of it is worth mentioning, worth looking at, and you know, there is a lot of decks that really need to get rid of artifacts and enchantments, especially like ad nauseum style decks, stuff like that. And then maybe getting an attacker for Tymna, or getting rid of an important creature that happens to be tapped that your opponents control. Now, it's cEDH, so the amount of tapped creatures is lower than in 60 card formats because we're just generally attacking a bit less because of the way that the play patterns tend to work out where boards get gummed up. I don't know. It's a unique card. It's very efficiently rated for what it does and the amount of flexibility it provides, for sure. So, you know, maybe worth looking at. Temperate and Solitude's kind of cute. It's good card advantage for red if you are in a deck where you know you're going to be attacking with a single creature a lot. And that's it for our section here. So that's the Kamigawa spoilers as of right now. It is Sunday, January 30th. So I'm going to be releasing this tomorrow. It's been an interesting spoiler season so far. I think all of the cards with channel are gonna be the most interesting cards that come out of this set. So far, I really don't have a legendary creature that I'm like super pumped to brew with, apart from Satoru, which we already did with Hire, which is pretty cool. But there's definitely enough like little pieces here and there of the cards that have come out so far that there's a few worth talking about and a few interesting cards. If I missed any, if I scrolled by some cards that you guys think are actually pretty cool for cEDH, I'd love to hear about that in the comments down below. If you think I'm wrong about any of my evaluations so far, I'd love to hear about that as well. I'd love to hear feedback and opinions, stuff like that. And if you want to analyze these spoilers in real time with the Comedian MTG Discord, check out the Discord link down below. You can just click it and jump in for free. Now, there are private Patreon channels, and I've already made some deck channels for some patrons due to the fact that there's some cool new brews coming out, and you know, there's some interesting stuff happening. If you want to check out the new Takeshi, one of the two, Tameshi Reality Architect, we have a couple people in the Discord working on those. This is a bunch of new stuff happening in the Discord right now, and I hope you guys come check it out. If you like content like this, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And if you want to be one of those people who can chat me up about having their own special channels in the Discord and stuff like that, if you want to have your name in the show notes at the end of the show, check out the Comedian MTG Patreon. It helps out the channel a ton and keeps the lights on. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Hope you guys have an amazing week. Peace.